So this week I had a package turn up in the mail, and I wasn't expecting anything, and I opened it up and it had no idea who it was from, and then I looked a bit closely at the label on the envelope, and it was from Peter Wynn's Score, which is a clothing shop, right? And I received in the mail a 2025 Parramatta training shirt, which as a Parramatta fan I thought, this is unreal. Now I know not everyone's into football, but the thought that came to mind was to wear it this morning, because I thought, we're in Parramatta heartland, surely, but I didn't. I chose not to, because they were terrible last week. As I was thinking about it a little bit, I just thought, if I turned up wearing a Parramatta shirt, it would say something about me. Hold that thought. But it would say something about me. It's like an identity marker. So if I go to a Parramatta game and I see other people in Parramatta jerseys, it is amazing the conversations I've had with complete strangers, because there's an identity piece that they're displaying that I can relate to and I feel like I'm part of. So I want to spend a bit of time today talking about something we could do as a community, something you could do as a community that would be an identity marker for the people around us. So, we're going to talk about Sabbath. I don't know what comes to mind when you hear Sabbath, or when you think about Sabbath, or if you've had any experience with the Sabbath, or you think it's some ancient Hebrew thing. I think it was in the Ten Commandments, but I'm not really sure. In fact, it's probably one of the Ten Commandments that we've completely chose to ignore. But let's have a bit of a look at some of the things Scripture says about it, to see if we could explore what would it look like to become a community of people who embrace the Sabbath because God has set it up as a good thing, and if we could embrace it together, how it could be an identity marker to those around us to show the goodness and the love of God. So let's dig into this. So we first see anything to do with the Sabbath right back in the creation account. Some of this will be on your screen. So in Genesis chapter 2, we read this. And this is the creation story. And by the seventh day, God completed his work which he had done, and he rested or ceased on the seventh day from all his work which he had done. So God blessed the seventh day and sanctified it as his own. That is, he set apart as holy from the other days, because in it he rested from all his work which he had created and done. This is the first time anything is mentioned in the Bible about being holy. If you went back to this creation account and figured out, well, what is holy? What does holy mean? What is holy is the Sabbath day. It's set apart. It's different from. But it's not God doing nothing. It's God actually creating something on the seventh day. He created the Sabbath, a rest. And a rest is not a passive thing, it's actually an active thing. We enter into rest, we embrace rest, we engage in rest. And we'll talk about that a bit more shortly. So the Sabbath day, right at the beginning, designed by God for the flourishing of humanity and the created order. That's its purpose. It's a good part of the created order. It's God's mindful commitment to time. Because in reality, we can only ever connect with God in time, in the present. We can't connect with God in the past or in the future. We connect with God in the here and now, in the present. So there's something in God's wisdom that says, I'm going to carve out a space in a regular weekly rhythm where you can be present. That sounds like a gift. This emphasis on the Sabbath at creation indicates that it's actually for everyone and everything. Some of us could be stuck in, no, it's just something for the Israelites, for the Jewish nation. And just so you know, those who follow Judaism today still practice the Sabbath. There are some branches of Christianity that practice the Sabbath, Seventh-day Adventists, for example. So this is not something that's disappeared. This is something that's still there, but I think, generally speaking, in Protestant Christianity, particularly in the West, it's forgotten. And I wonder what it would be like for us to explore it a little bit and see, is there something in this that God might want to do in us and through us for his glory? And it might be good for us as well. So, the idea of stopping might be foreign to some of us. Just want to read this paraphrase. It's the Message paraphrase of a passage in Isaiah. And I love how it's put by Peterson. He says, "If you watch your step on the Sabbath and don't use my holy day for personal advantage, if you treat the Sabbath as a day of joy, God's holy day as a celebration, if you honour it by refusing business as usual, making money running here and there, then you'll be free to enjoy God." One of the hardest things in my Christian walk over many decades has been to enjoy God. For many years, I didn't think that was even possible. And then for many years, I thought I had to jump through a bunch of hoops to please him and make him happy, but that didn't feel very freeing to me. I wonder what it would be like to have a regular weekly rhythm where we can enjoy God. The next time we see the idea of Sabbath in Scripture is when the Israelites are rescued out of Egypt. So let's read that account. It's in Exodus 20, part of what we would call the Ten Commandments. And this is the fourth commandment. And God says to Moses, "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord our God. On it you shall do no work, neither you nor your son or your daughter, nor your male or female servant, nor your animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that's in them, but he rested on the seventh day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." As you might be aware, the Ten Commandments are repeated in the book of Deuteronomy. So I just want to read that account as well. So in Deuteronomy chapter 5, starting in verse 12, we read this. "Observe the Sabbath by keeping it holy as the Lord your God commanded you. 6 days you shall labour and do all your work, but the seventh day is a Sabbath to the Lord your God." Sounds a bit repetitive, but it's not exactly the same. "On it you shall not do any work, neither you nor your son or daughter or your male or female servant or your ox or your donkey or any of the animals, nor any foreigner residing in your towns, so that your male and female servants may rest as you do. Remember that you were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." Did you notice any differences between those two passages, between the two accounts from what we would call the Ten Commandments? Don't know if you did. It took me a while to see this. But I noticed that in Exodus, God tells us to remember the Sabbath, whereas in Deuteronomy, he instructs observance of the Sabbath. Two different words. And as I read into this a little bit, the ancient rabbis tell that this difference between remembering and observing actually has to do with the ordering of time. So to put it basically, if the Sabbath was, which it is for Jewish people, from the Friday evening through to the Saturday evening, so Saturday is their Sabbath. So to put it very simply, Sunday, Monday and Tuesday are about remembering the Sabbath that just was. Wednesday, Thursday, Friday are about devoting to prepare to observe the Sabbath that's coming. Therefore, Sabbath becomes the focal point of your week, actually of your life. It helps you go into the weekly rhythms where Sabbath is the thing that life is centered around. I don't know what you think when I say that. I think, oh, that's a bit rich. Well, I don't know about that. I don't know if I want to center my life around something called a Sabbath. But there's this idea of remembering, observing. Remembering, observing. The German theologian Jürgen Moltmann puts it like this. This will be on the screen. He says, if we sum up the commandment and the reason for it, we get the following picture. God creates and shapes a rich and colourful world in order to celebrate the feast of creation with all his creatures on the Sabbath. In other words, he's saying what the seventh day was about was the pinnacle, the focus of the creation. God did all the creating work so that he could experience and allow his creation to experience the holy day, the day that's set apart, where the Sabbath is something you just long for. And in God's grace and generosity, this thing that we long for happens every week in the natural rhythms of the created order. Another difference is the themes behind the command from Exodus and Deuteronomy. So on the screen you'll see just something in bold here from the Exodus account. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that's in them, but he rested on the seventh day. So it's bringing the command for Sabbath back to the created rhythms and order. Okay? Remember, Moses is receiving this at Mount Sinai as God is creating the nation of Israel. And then the Deuteronomy account, you'll see on the screen in bold, he says, remember that you were slaves in Egypt and that the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. So the Exodus account has this theme of creation. The Deuteronomy account has this theme of liberation, of freedom. And so Moses reminds his people, practice this because you have spent, as a group of people, 400 years enslaved where you worked 7 days a week. Remember that. And remember it not just for you, but remember it for your servants, for your animals, for your land, for everything, even the visitors into your towns. Don't ever force that incessant work on others because you've been freed from it. It's funny, this idea of work, what constitutes work. By the time Jesus came on the scene, the Pharisees had got it down to a fine art what you could and could not do on the Sabbath day. They kept the Sabbath. And I think from Scripture, from memory, there's something like 38 clear do nots on the Sabbath, things you cannot do. By the time Jesus walked the earth, that had expanded out to hundreds of things that you could not do on the Sabbath, and you had to keep the letter of the law. Years ago, I was in Israel on a study tour with ACOM, and we were staying in a hotel in Jerusalem, and we were there on the Sabbath, on a Sabbath day. And the hotel we were staying in had 2 lifts, and they were both pretty busy. Now, one of the rules of the Sabbath, one of the commands of the Sabbath from Exodus is that you shall not create light or fire. That's creating, that's working, right? So in today's world, that rule has been taken. You cannot turn a light switch on. That would go against the rules of the Sabbath. So we turn up after looking around town, come back into the foyer of the hotel, there's 2 lifts, and the foyer is absolutely full of Jewish people. And so there's a Sabbath lift and a non-Sabbath lift. In the Sabbath lift, There's 24 floors. Every light is automatically put on. So if you get on that lift, it stops at every floor. Because if you got on as a Jewish person and pressed floor 17, you've turned a light on, you've done some work, you've broken the law. And so someone like me comes along and they're all waiting, hovering, and you walk into the non-Sabbath lift and they rush in. And it's like, can you hit floor 16, please? Can you hit floor 18, please? Can you touch floor... And it's like, what is going on? Now, that's to the nth degree, and we laugh about that, but that's the world Jesus was in. There were so many restrictions about what you could and couldn't do on the Sabbath. If you know anything of Jesus, he got into trouble on the Sabbath quite a bit with the Pharisees. They had some real issue with some things he did on the Sabbath. Just a few things. They won't be on your screen, but there's 5 healings at least that Jesus did on the Sabbath. In Matthew 12, we see Jesus heal a man with a withered hand. In Luke 13, we see Jesus heal a crippled woman. In Luke 14, we see Jesus heal a man in the Pharisee's house. In John 5, we see Jesus heal the invalid man at the pool of Bethesda. And in John 9, we see Jesus heal a man born blind. All things done on the Sabbath in front of the Pharisees. Now, as I was looking at these, I don't think there was any reason Jesus had to do these healings on the Sabbath. These were not urgent medical conditions. These are things that people had lived with for years, sometimes their whole life. So what was he doing? Well, these themes of creation and liberation that we see in Exodus and Deuteronomy, I think there's something in that Jesus wanted to display. The Sabbath themes of creation and liberation are evident in Jesus' healings. It seemed like to Jesus, doing good and healing on the Sabbath is a very good thing to do. It shows mercy, it saves life, it frees people from bondage. You know that passage where Jesus goes into a synagogue and he opens from the scroll of Isaiah and he reads the passage and he says, today this has been fulfilled in your healing. That passage that he read actually refers to, now we're going back a bit and this could be a whole sermon series, but in the rhythm of Sabbath in the Old Testament, every 7th day was a Sabbath, and then every 7th year there was the land had to lie fallow and have its rest. And then every 7 times 7th year, you get to that 50th year of Jubilee when all things went back to how they should be. That passage in Isaiah that Jesus read out was a Jubilee-based thing where people would experience freedom and healing and return to the goodness of the original position and creation in which they entered into the world. But that's a whole rabbit hole we could go down, but we're not going to do that this morning. There's an author called Adele Calhoun, and she supports this whole notion of liberation and freedom in Jesus' healings, and she says this. She says, Jesus took specific aim at the misunderstanding of the Sabbath. As Lord of the Sabbath, and that's one of the titles he gives himself, as Lord of the Sabbath, he freely interpreted the Sabbath command, claiming that God gave it to people as a gift to restore and recuperate the original good created order. So, what would be the benefit of us today in 2025 living in this part of the world to keep the Sabbath? What would be the benefit? Here's just a few things. Now, I will say, some of these things are from lived experience. I've been dabbling in this, is probably the best term, for about 12 years. And there have been times in that 12 years where I have kept the Sabbath quite well and have flourished. And there are times in that 12 years, because of family and work and other things, where it's just been a struggle and it hasn't happened. To be honest with you, right now, I'm in one of those flux moments where I'm not quite keeping the Sabbath as I'd like to, and I want to because I've experienced it in a way that says this makes a difference. But right now, just with work stuff and my wife changing work and 2 young adult kids at home and one's getting married later in the year and all this stuff going on, just seems hard at the moment. But here's some benefits of keeping the Sabbath. You might want to pay attention to this. We get to stop. Some of you feel uneasy with that because some of us have bought into the lie that our identity is wrapped up in what we produce and what we achieve and what we're part of and the job that we do. We get to rest. And as I said earlier, rest is not a passive thing. There's an active rest that you can do. We get to cease working for a day. What I'm not going to do is say anything about what you should and shouldn't do on a Sabbath. That needs to be worked out for you. But I'll give you an example of this idea of ceasing working. For me, doing anything in the yard, mowing, weeding, pruning, that feels like work. So I don't do it when I have a Sabbath. I've got a friend who loves gardening. And so when he has a Sabbath, he spends half the day outside in his yard. I couldn't think of anything worse. So there's not hard and fast rules. That's something you're going to have to negotiate. But anyway, we cease working. We get to slow down enough to take notice of what's going on around us. We are the most distracted generation ever. And there's a lot of studies that we've always got some sort of input happening. We get to take notice of God and his blessings. We get to be present without distraction to those around us that we want to spend time with or they want to spend time with us. Sabbath helps us grow in trusting God. Remember that story of the Israelites in the desert and they had no food and water and God supplied water out of the rock and then every morning this stuff would appear on the ground. And they were saying, what is it? And that's literally what the word manna means. What is it? And God told them, every morning, go out and collect as much as you need. Don't collect too much. It's a trust thing. Don't take more than you need, because if you take more than you need, it's just going to spoil and go off, get full of maggots. But on the 6th day, go and get twice as much, because on the Sabbath, you're not to work. And when they took more than they needed on the 6th day, it didn't spoil and go off. It was a trust exercise. Is God going to supply what I need? If I stopped working for a day, is God still able to supply what I need? Or do I think I have to control that for myself? It's a trust thing. Sabbath reminds us of our freedom. Sabbath leads to transformation. Sabbath restores our soul. How many of us need that? Sabbath helps us live into healthy rhythms of life for the sake of others. Part of the reason I'm in the role I'm in, that conference executive put this role in place, was that there's an understanding that if we have healthy leaders, we're going to have healthy churches. It's not solely dependent on that, but boy, it's related. And if you're a leader, whether you're leading your family, a business, whatever, if you're a leader who is just giving and giving and giving and working and working and working and never stop to replenish and refill yourself, that ends badly every time. Sabbath helps us grow in having an eternal perspective on life. Sabbath helps us live into simplicity and contentment. Wow. Imagine if we were a content lot. Not always chasing the next thing and the next dollar and the next experience and the next gadget. Sabbath teaches us grace, that we can't earn God's love. And the picture I have for this is, I remember when my daughters were born and there was this useless little child, really. They couldn't do anything. And sometimes you just spend minutes, even hours, just looking at them. Just going, oh, this is awesome. You can't do a thing for me. You probably don't even know I'm here. But the love for this child, that's how God sees us. That's how God sees us. We can't earn it, but man, we can live in the reality of that. That we could have a day where we're doing nothing, we're not achieving or producing, and God can look at us and go, you are so loved. Not because of what you do, but because of who you are. Sabbath helps us with that. Sabbath leads us to worship and prayer because we become more aware of His presence, not only in us, but in all things. Take a walk through nature, go and sit at the beach and tell me you don't feel close to God. Sabbath nurtures our friendship with God, it nurtures our relationship with others, but Sabbath can be ruined through legalism. That idea about the rules about what you can and can't do. So that's why I'm not going to go there. Lynn Barb, an author who wrote a book called Sabbath Keeping, this will be on your screen. She says, what is the Sabbath? Well, it's a weekly day of rest and worship. It's a day to cease working and relax in God's care for us. A day to stop the things that occupy our work days and participate in activities that nurture peace, worship, relationships, celebration and thankfulness. The purpose of the Sabbath is to clear away the distractions of our lives so we can rest in God and experience God's grace in a new way. And we get to do that every week. The more I've looked into this, the more I've experienced this, the more I've read about this, the more I've taught about this, I can't think of another practice that we could do personally and communally that would show the goodness and love of God to the people around us. Man, it's going to get them asking questions, but that's a good thing. We often talk about as Christians, let's live counterculturally to those around us. This is one of the most countercultural things you could do. Stopping for a day. And what do you do on that day? You do anything that's going to fill your tank that doesn't feel like normal work. You're going to be intentional about connecting with God, connecting with others, being grateful for His gifts and His provision. Whatever that looks like for you. When Jesus says, take my yoke upon you, yoke, that wooden beam that sits across two oxen, where the lead oxen, the one who's obedient to the master's commands, is yoked, is strapped into the junior oxen who's learning how to do the work. Jesus says, take my yoke upon you because it's light and it's easy. Learn to walk in the rhythms that I've actually created for you. Now, I know from experience, some of you are sitting here going, oh, this sounds pretty good. And some of you are going, this sounds pretty good, but I don't know how that could ever work. And some of you are resisting this. Going, that sounds like a load of rubbish. You don't understand my situation. You don't understand the demands on my life. You're right, I don't, and I don't have to. Final quote on the screen from the same book. And I put this up because this is my experience. My commitment to the Sabbath didn't come from theological conviction, guilt, or any outside force. I experienced it. I felt it was a gift, and I believed God wanted me to experience that gift every week. And I'm glad it happened that way. What if one of the best things you could do from an evangelistic point of view is as a community start to make a commitment to what would it look like for us to Sabbath together. Now that doesn't necessarily mean all be together, but you're in a community that supports and encourages this practice. What could that look like? What would your family members say if you were decidedly acting differently on one day a week? What would your neighbours say? What would your work colleagues say, your friends say? What questions would they ask? The obvious question is, why? Why? And what an opportunity to explain the goodness of God. That this is something not for ancient people. This is not something just for people who follow Judaism today. There's actually a gift in this for us. Now, if there's anything to be said about Sabbath, let's just say there's 100% to be said. What I've just done this morning is probably 1.5%. Can I encourage you? Even explore this for yourselves, maybe in home groups, maybe in conversations. What could it look like to possibly head down this path a little bit? What would that look like for us? What would we do? What do we need to understand? But my encouragement to you as a community, in today's age where everything runs as it runs, this could be one of the key things that you could do together that will demonstrate God's goodness and love and character to those around you. Because there's so much in it that relies on us just trusting, relies on us being grateful, relies on us not succumbing to the patterns of this world, but resisting it because we're renewing our mind and we're understanding something different. But as that last quote said, the only thing I can do from standing here saying for someone who's been dabbling in this for the last dozen years or so, it is worth it. Am I kicking goals with it right now? No, I'm not. But I've had moments, I've had glimpses where I go, this is awesome. And I have committed the rest of my life to going, I want to find Sabbath rhythms in my world, in my life, in my family, because I know that it's not only good for me, it's good for those around me. And it's part of God's good created order. Let me pray for us as we consider that. Jesus, I thank you for your wisdom. I thank you for your example. And I thank you that you are Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus, you created the Sabbath. And so the first thing I want to ask this morning is that we would trust you. That if you invite us into something, it's because it is what is best for us. And the big issue right back in the garden with the fruit and the serpent was, do you trust God at his word or not? And so I want to pray for courage across this community this morning. I want to pray for a boldness to take one step towards, to consider what this might look like, to consider how this could be a good thing for us as a community and our families and us as individuals, our neighbours and our friends. Everything in us will be resisting this, Jesus. And I pray against the enemy and his lies and his schemes, that you would lead this community in what you would have for them so that they would have life and life to the full. That's our prayer together. Amen. So we'll come to a time of communion now. So can I invite you to go to one of the tables around the room and take the elements, maybe come back and just in your own time, spend a little bit of time having a conversation with Jesus about, Jesus, what might you want me to do? If communion represents the new covenant that he has invited us into, the covenant where he is in us through his Spirit, Christ in us, Jesus, if you are in us and leading us, what might you lead us into in terms of Sabbath? Let's explore that together as you have communion. Thank you. Yep.